I'd just like to thank everyone again for coming, and thank you to the last panel that we had before the break. It's been such a lovely day. We've covered all of our panels and a lovely day yesterday too. It's been an absolute delight so far to be organizing this. I feel that it's maybe leading me into a false sense of security of what a conference is really like when you organize them. This is my first one, I think Alicia's as well. So maybe they are all this wonderful. Who knows? So yes, I can see the number starting to jump up there. So for our final part of the day, we obviously have our keynote here with Dr. Niamh Campbell, and I'll hand over to Alicia in just a second, who's going to chair this session. And then at 5 o'clock, we're going to move on to a slightly more open roundtable. Anyone who does want to say anything can, and that's going to be kicked off by Dr. Katrina Leahy here. So looking very much forward to that. So I think without any further ado, I'll pass over to Alicia.
Hi, so thank you all so much. Tom has said it all, but we're so grateful for everybody's contributions, everybody's really interesting questions, and everybody's very kind listening throughout these 2 days. So can't believe we're now at our last keynote and subsequent discussion. So, and it will be a great one. So Dr. Niamh Campbell from University College Dublin is going to give a keynote titled How They Met Themselves, or the Poetics of Deep Emotional Time. So Niamh Campbell's debut novel, This Happy, was published by Wheaton, Field and Nicholson in 2020 and has been shortlisted for the On Post Irish Book Awards 2020 and the John McGahern Book Awards 2021 and the Cleary Group Irish Novel of the Year Award 2021. She won a Sunday Times Award, Short Story Award in 2020, and her short work has appeared in The Stinging Fly, the Dublin Review, Gorse, Banshee, Tangerine, Granta, Five Dials, and Some Such Stories. She has published a monograph, Sacred Weather, on John McGahern, and is currently writer in residence at University College Dublin. So really looking forward to this talk, and yeah, take it away whenever you want to, Niamh.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Tom, and congratulations on the last day of your first conference. And I have to say, when you do it in real life, it's much better. It's even more fun. So you will have that ahead of you. It's a bit more frenzy, but it's definitely more fun. So I'm really glad to be here today, and I'm going to try and screen share now, hopefully successfully, in order to show you my PowerPoint as I talk, so that you're not looking at me. Okay, let me try and get rid of this. And that's the best I can do. So this paper, I'm going to range between creative and academic in this paper in a sort of mixing everything up sort of way, and hopefully it will be basically entertaining as opposed to massively informative. So the title of my paper today is How They Met Themselves, or the Poetics of Deep Emotional Time, and the subtitle would be, or this was the original title of my book, but nobody else liked it. So my name is Niamh Campbell. I'm the current writer in residence at UCD, but from this autumn I'll actually be lecturing full-time in English and creative writing at Maynooth, where I was a postdoctoral fellow from 2019 to 2020, and I'll be working on traditional research rather than creative writing. I'm just going to step up and shut my door because there's a dog barking outside, so bear with me one moment. My apologies, I'll jump right back in there. So in other words, I work between the academy and the arts world, both analysing the work of other people and making my own. These agendas don't clash as much as you might think, and perhaps ironically, the fact that my first novel was published last year and my second will be published in February is partly down to the stop-start nature of teaching contracts between which I can write. Academic scholarship doesn't tend to make me overthink my fiction writing, but fiction writing does mean I am drawn when teaching and researching to modes of approach that look for style and beauty over information, or which return to the idea of the text as event and experience, and of writing as something which creates atmospheres. So I'm very grateful to be invited to do this keynote paper for Out of Bounds today, because it is my very first keynote, and because it gives me a chance to try and straddle the two imaginaries in which I work, that of fiction writing and that of close reading and or subjecting fiction to theoretical processes that would interpret it in certain ways. In 2019, as Alicia said, I published a monograph, which was called Sacred Weather, Atmospheric Essentialism in the Work of John McGahern, and was based on the doctoral thesis that I wrote for the most part between the ages of 24 and 25, about 3 years before I began writing a novel. I see this now as a basis for quite a bit of what I was trying to achieve with This Happy, the aforementioned novel, a work that was once entitled How They Met Themselves, and which is still in some of the lurking subspaces of Amazon, still entitled How They Met Themselves. What follows here will be in some ways the story of a name. So when you publish a novel, I've learned the chances of its original title surviving editorial intervention and the wisdom of marketing teams is sometimes slim. This Happy came about because my editor, agent, and myself brainstormed from sentences extracted from the manuscript in a restaurant in Soho. This Happy itself comes from the sentence, "We will never be this happy again," which is spoken by the newlywed protagonist to her husband as they stand, having skived off work for the day, on Howth Head. The title works and I like it, but How They Met Themselves has a loftier lineage, being taken from the Dante Gabriel Rossetti painting that you can see here. This work imagines the pre-Raphaelite luminary Rossetti and his bride, Elizabeth Siddal, meeting their own doubles in a forest, and it was painted in the 1860s. To meet your double, your doppelganger, is a herald of death, and Rossetti painted the work 2 years after Siddal had indeed lost her life to a laudanum overdose. When I started writing the novel, I was concerned with weaving a theme of doubles, repetition, and lives unlived into the story. And in its final version, these are deeply sublimated and perhaps not even visible, but still, for me, there. The loss of the original title and burial of symbols is something I allowed to happen because so much of the book is deeply personal to me in ways which are either irrelevant or superfluous to its plot and thematic unity, but which I always hope, spark occult associations in certain readers pertaining to their own intimate lives. So with this paper, I'm going to talk a little about process as a kind of excavation of what I'm calling emotional deep time, or profound but perplexing memories and images that persist in psychic life but do not correlate to information. When I write with this associative, cumulative, miasmic sense of image and memory to hand. I have a lot of images, a lot of rooms and dreams and composites and atmospheres and olfactory memories and accordion file-like madeleines and stage props, which occur to me constantly and which have been in some cases with me for many years, which crucially I often don't understand but do intuit to be significant. This clutter feels more like the base material of my work than the words themselves, which can often fall short of truly doing what you want them to do. There is a scene in This Happy in which I tried to make this process obvious and also to recompose an actual space I spent some time in at a dramatic point in my life. In this part of the book, the protagonist Alana, who is 30, remembers seeing her husband's home, a flat in the bottom of a Victorian-era villa in Dublin 3, for the first time. And I'll read very briefly from the novel here. The first time I came to this apartment, we were drunk, both of us drunk, acquainted about a month, and crashing up the avenue with the tendrils of our phone chargers catching in Privet and Escalonia. The night was still and otherworldly, smelling strongly of the sea, the several smells of the sea, heaped or stepped and distinct, canine, decaying, bodily, as we swept into the garden, tripping over pots and through the door. And at once, even though I was drunk, I was taken aback at the mess, at the 2 cliffs of junk crushed onto either side of the corridor. After I married him and moved in, I came to believe that the walls of clutter would never be shifted now, that they couldn't be disturbed. Grit rings or dust or dried topsoil where certain foothills of junk had been disrupted declared the presence of something sedimentary and permanent. If I rose in the night to use the bathroom, I had to pass through it in darkness, and in these moments its force turned it into the first corridor in the world. It became the alleyway between our house and the neighbours in childhood, the alleyway where I looked up at cruising clouds and seabirds in the channel of sky, where I was lonely and ill at ease. It became the corridor of leaf-splashed perspex in Harry's cottage and the still older, still more lost, galley of wicker furniture tacked to my grandparents' house. It became the eye of the needle and the birth canal. So This Happy is not biographical, but I draw on my mesas and foothills of mnemonic junk throughout, and while I was writing it, my grandmother died. I hadn't been to this room in her council terrace for a long time, but I spent much of my childhood in this house, and I found a picture of it on daft.ie from a few years ago. And it's a place that comes back to me in terms of memory compulsively. So I had a look for it, and I found the galley of wicker furniture, which I can remember completely differently. So it seems like the new owners have replaced the perspex with vinyl, but the image in my head of this room is completely different. And I know this is a very common experience, but it's sort of pointing towards something to do with tension between memory and reality that I'm hoping to talk about a little bit in this paper. So moving on then to the slightly more academic approach. Because I believe everyone's PhD dissertation topic secretly reveals their soul, this paper will now try to account for this process with an academic slant by putting my PhD and its distillate ideas alongside this happy, or the process of writing this happy. And my aim, very briefly, is to explore or elucidate an idea derived from the writer John McGahern, that of memory becoming imagination, which I found liberating as a writer and thinker, and which, in my opinion, charges his work with a quality of depth and symbolism in excess of naturalism. This effect is nonetheless emphatically static because it is contained within fixed and recurrent images. This is one such image, and it's a quite typical example. It's compared by the poet and the critic Eamon Grennan to a Dutch interior, which is to say a visual image produced with attention to fabricated or synthetic or curated light and to the surface of things. And it comes from McGahern's first novel, The Barracks, which was published in 1963. A boy of 12 and two dark-haired girls were close about her at the fire. They'd grown uneasy in the way children can indoors in the failing light. The bright golds and scarlets of the religious pictures on the walls had faded. Their glass glittered now in the sudden flashes of firelight, and as it deepened, the dusk turned reddish from the Sacred Heart lamp that burned before the small wickerwork crib of Bethlehem on the mantelpiece. Only the cups and white saucers laid ready on the table for their father's tea were white and brilliant. I'm not the first reader or scholar to observe this visual emphasis, which is more than ornamental in McGahern's work, but when I was researching my doctorate, I searched as hard as I could for theoretical, artistic, psychoanalytic, and even theological frameworks with which to account for it, resulting in a lot of overlap and repetition, which I might, for the sake of clarity, reduce to three ideas here. These are the art critic Michael Fried's idea of a binary in 18th century French painting of absorption and theatricality, as updated to apply to photography in his 2008 book, Why Photography Matters as Art as Never Before. 2, Thomist aesthetics, or an aesthetic code derived from the writings of Thomas Aquinas, as these are interpreted by Kevin O'Reilly, and especially the concepts of visio, or seeing or apprehension, and adequacio, or adapting oneself to comprehending something external by subtly changing within. And finally, number 3, the queer theorist Leo Bersani's adaptation for art theoretical purposes of an idea from psychoanalysis, which is called the enigmatic signifier, and I'll probably talk about that more than anything else. Each of these ideas seem complicated and disparate, but what all three have in common is a concern with the tension attained between viewer and view, self and other, subject and object, which privileges encounter over interpretation. They add up to a poetics of incomprehension and humility in the face of something we know we should respond to, but which we cannot assimilate. The example I always give as shorthand for this is meeting something deeply meaningful but completely baffling in a dream, the signifier that never discloses what it signifies, but which always calls upon us to engage with it anyway. Because these three thinkers, or between these three thinkers, there is also the assumption that this encounter with something that doesn't permit us to breach its boundaries is aesthetic, so that it is also always an experience of beauty. So to introduce John McGahern to those of you who are not familiar with him, he was the author of 6 novels and a memoir, simply called Memoir, which retrospectively recycled or revisited, sometimes verbatim, scenes and scenarios that had appeared in fictional works and even appeared more than once in those fictional works, which is to say that towards the end of his life, he wrote a biographical book which consciously reproduced aspects of fiction, declaring them to be biographical, or perhaps declaring the biography to be fictionalized, and I find that fascinating. His literary style throughout his career is plainer, simple, and inflected by the austere modernism of Samuel Beckett. It's also expressive of a considered, reflective, and sparely imagist imagination. He worked with the past a lot, writing about the 1940s and 50s, but also updated his concern with Irish rural life after independence and the life of the nuclear family, which is often depicted as brutally patriarchal, especially, with the sedate, almost platonically balanced Book of Seasons that is his final work of fiction, That They May Face the Rising Sun, published in 2002. McGahern is also an official, canonical, renowned Irish writer in the cultural mould of Seamus Heaney and Brian Friel. It's not surprising then that excerpts from Rising Sun were used as prompts in the Leaving Certificate Practical Art exam in 2004 or 2005, which is how I first encountered him, as a practice prompt to a visual art in a mock exam at school when I was about 17. Rising Sun is a novel about the rhythms of life and time over the course of about a year in a small lakeside community in Leitrim. It seems to take place in 1988 or 89 and is filled with rich ekphrastic pauses in which the landscape and its atmosphere are described as gentle sensoria whose effects interrupt and slow down the pace of the narrative. So I can't remember the specific excerpt which was used in the 2004 or 2005 Leaving Certificate, but it would have read something like this. Close by, 2 swans fished in the shallows, 3 dark cygnets by their side. Farther out, a whole stretch of water was alive and rippling with the moving shoal of perch. Elsewhere, except when it was ruffled by sudden summer gusts, the water was like glass. Or alternatively, it might have read like this. The fields, long sodden with rain, had hardened in the drying winds. Small flowers started to appear on banks and ditches and in the shelter of the hedges. Around Mary's old house by the lake, with the ash tree growing in the middle of the living room, hundreds of narcissi met the spring with beauty. Extracted, these passages seem beautiful, but not as remarkable as they appear when embedded in the text itself. So in the context of the novel That They May Face the Rising Sun as a whole, the thinness of plot juxtaposed with these careful moments of unshowy, unobstructive, but enduringly attentive description combine to produce an ambience that is almost outside time. The critic Owen Flannery has looked at this stylistic decision, which is deliberate, from an eco-critical perspective, but my own approach as a student was to respond to them as if they were images or textual effects, moments of enchantment, organized with the intention of seeming both artificial and real, stylized spells acting as gateways to atmosphere and mood. At 16, however, I first read these excerpts in a specific and serendipitous way. My worksheet, and this is during the Leaving Cert practice exam, had an error on it. The passage was duplicated by mistake, and it read like this. Close by, 2 swans fished in the shallows, 3 dark cygnets by their side. Farther out, a whole stretch of water was alive and rippling with a moving shoal of perch. Elsewhere, except where it was ruffled by sudden summer gusts, the water was like glass. Close by, 2 swans fished in the shallows, 3 dark cygnets by their side. Farther out, a whole stretch of water was alive and rippling with a moving shoal of perch. Elsewhere, except where it was ruffled by sudden summer gusts, the water was like glass. Having no context, I presumed it was deliberate and that the novel simply read this way, that McGahern, a writer I had then never read, repeated passages verbatim to produce some kind of effect, profundity, or strangeness. At the time, I found this pretentious and decided to use another prompt, something about a cafe, and paint an ornamental coffee pot for the Leaving Cert test instead. I can still remember the jolt of the repeated passage and the weirdness of it, the flash of irritation, the rejection of what I then considered a piously or sonorously Irish glorification of the simplicity of country life. I wasn't into that kind of thing then. It said nothing to me about my life. Years later at college, I read Rising Sun as a course text and not only realized the printer error of yore, but fell in love with it and went on to write a dissertation preoccupied with its author and become a writer influenced by McGahern myself. The thing is, a strong part of my empathetic attachment to this writer, whose writing of rural tradition still says nothing to me about my life, actually pivoted and still does precisely on repetition, on the alienating oddness of intact scenes visited and revisited and restated, on the temporal or textural stutter suggested by images and memories, which in other books like The Dark and Amongst Women and Memoir proliferate. So just to be clear, these are images which across the course of a career actually recur in the books and are described often using exactly the same phrases. So they are the same scenes coming back again and again. They include the tongue and groove boards on the ceiling of a bedroom, which are counted by a boy waiting for his father, who is in the habit of touching him intimately at night to come to bed. They include a bed with broken brass bells in which this infraction happens and or in which a mother lies dying and or lovers come together. A lamp made from a Chianti bottle that pops up in several bachelor digs, a devastating sequence in which a boy, the original of which is the young McGahern, who is not permitted to attend his mother's funeral mass and burial, imagines it moment by staring at the face of a clock, and an image of a dark-haired woman in a blue dress who comes towards more than one male protagonist on a dance floor or a city street. Between Rising Sun and Memoir, we see the adaptation of one such primal image to the purposes of a subplot, and through this get a glimpse perhaps of the process involved. So here is a character in Rising Sun describing the difficult life and painful death of an abused wife, a woman named Margaret Quinn. This is the fiction. Margaret had the 8 children and then she got bad. One morning Johnny was out with the gun and he saw her walking in her nightdress and her bare feet in the dew before it was fully light to see if the coolness would ease the pain. In the end, the school children didn't want to pass the gate on their way to school because they were frightened by her cries. And here is the same image, or rather some components of it, as reproduced in Memoir, where it is tagged as biographical. Years later, a daughter of the same Mrs. Finnan who had taught me in Coote Hall told me that in the very early hours of one morning in that summer, her mother had come on my mother, walking barefooted in her nightdress in a field close to the barracks. She told Mrs. Finnan that she hadn't been able to sleep and that the cold dew of the grass on her feet eased her pain. I was so plunged back into time and memory by the images of the nightdress and her bare feet in Gilligan's Field or Lenihan's Orchard that I neglected to ask Marie what she thought her own mother was doing walking about on her own in the fields in those grey hours. So for context, Memoir spends quite a lot of time on McGahern's memories of his mother who died when he was 10. And these are transfigured into extremely intense sense memories a lot of the time. But this is an example of a memory of his mother. Her name was Susan, which doesn't come from him, but from someone else. And as you can see, this forms the basic gestalt of the scene in Rising Sun. So the woman walking barefoot here is again McGahern's mother, Susan, whose death when her son was 10 marked his life and inflects his work to a great degree. Gilligan's Field and Lenihan's Orchards are places the writer spent time with her as a child, places that take on mythical resonance to the adult writer. This is one of the most moving and intriguing transmigrations of a gestalt image or basic outline, a barefoot woman close to death in open space in the writer's work, and its shape is defined by pain in the original impulse, but reshaped arguably by empathy in the fictional one. Margaret is a minor character in Rising Sun, and framing her with this ancient and intimate formation, showing us the woman in this position, and elsewhere in the book we see Margaret raped on her wedding day, might be a fortuitous use of memory converted to imagination, or it might reference something, anger or personal investment, or possibly both. It gives Margaret the dignity of McGahern's mother and allows him to visit his mother's suffering obliquely at the same time. This is all conjecture, of course. The writer never explained these overlaps. They are simply there. In Memoir, he is too dazed by memory to ask why another woman in this time and place, 1950s Leitrim, is walking alone at dawn. So images and static scenes are a key component of McGahern's literary style. It's not just that they recur throughout books, it's that the description of things distilled into still moments is a very common trope that he uses. And he makes this clear as a deliberate thing in The Image, which is a short and slightly obscure statement of artistic intent McGahern published in 1971. And in this he writes, "Art is an attempt to create a world in which we can live. if not for a long time or forever, still a world of the imagination over which we can reign. And by reign, I mean to reflect purely on our situation through this created world of ours, this Medusa's mirror, allowing us to see and to celebrate even the totally intolerable. In this same essay, The Image, this capacity to freeze moments and images in a Medusa's mirror is described as utterly random, spontaneous, and mysterious. That which transfixes us may only be, quote, a yard of lead pipe we saw in terror or in laughter once, end quote. This peculiar line is for me the most telling of the essay because it marks the origination of static images in trauma. A banal artifact glimpsed at a moment of terror remains both embedded in memory and colored with emotion. It may not be possible to convey this emotion. The yard of pipe in itself seems meaningless, mere rubble, and its appearance in a scene may seem like naturalism or the incidental debris picked up by a field recording. The detail is so banal it makes the authorial eye seem passive or at the very least disinterested, not curating anything, but its power for the writer himself, which may or may not come across to the reader, is immense. In reading McGahern, I tried to explain the ways in which meeting these naturalist scenes sets off associations, hints of meaning, because their repetition and recurrence across books suggests an idée fixe. Of course, I'm not the first person to see this, and Anne Gortson has written about the role of objects and surfaces in the writer's work very well. And some readers would also argue that the role of these objects, umbrellas being another ubiquitous one, is partly a form of Beckettian absurd. There is another angle though, that of privacy, an approach to scene setting which allows for absorption and what Michael Fried called non-address, which is essentially the presence of something or someone in a context that suggests communication, namely a painting or a staged photograph, but whose positioning, gesture, or facial expression implies psychological absence, preoccupation, or some form of non-address. So Fried uses this to describe images, and I am applying it to McGahern's descriptive images, particularly when there are people. And what this involves is someone being presented, a figure being presented to us in a way which suggests that they are performing or serving or addressing us, or that we should be concerned with them. But in some way, there's a sense of psychic interiority or absence, which means we can never fully read them. A very famous example and a very sort of clear example of this that Fried uses is Edouard Manet's A Bar at the Folies Bergère, in which the indifference or inertia of an enervated barmaid positioned as one of a number of objects or wares in the bar is simultaneously quite confrontational. So in this picture, this is not a very good reproduction, but the expression on her face is extremely interesting, as they always are in Manet. She is facing us, about to serve us, but she is, I had to explain this, she is definitely not in the moment. Their expression is very disturbing. This example particularly brings capitalist alienation into things, presenting us, if we read it in this way, with an image of a person who is serving and instrumentalized, but whose gaze doesn't allow us to comprehend or consume her at all. I don't have time here to go into the experience of tracing this particular form of pictorial non-address in McGahern, although it is there repeatedly, but I do want to present you with a complicated variant on it from one of McGahern's compatriots and friends, the Irish artist Patrick Swift. And this is also the image that became the cover of my book. Swift was a post-war painter and writer from Dublin, whose work is less well known than that of his peer Lucian Freud, but which does resemble Freud's work in theme and tonality, and Freud and Swift worked together. They shared a studio at one point. The difference between them is particularly Swift's attention to texture and surface in his work as ever so slightly blurred. His work doesn't go in for the more mercilessly literal flesh tones of Freud. It tends to have a slightly dreamlike distance and a slightly non-figurative energy to it as well, and this picture is a good example. So Swift and McGahern as young men were friends in 1960s Dublin and London. And in an essay after Swift's death, McGahern remembers a day they spent together in Soho in the late 1950s. Drinking gin together on the Bayswater Road, the young men toast St. Augustine and turn conversationally once again to this idea of the image. To the image, how all artistic activity centers on bringing the clean image that moves us out into the light. On that we could agree. Paddy quoted Aquinas, "The image is a principle of our knowledge. It is that from which our intellectual activity begins, not as a passing stimulus, but as an enduring foundation." And the 8:40 out of Euston was still hours away. In Thomist Aesthetics, which is a broad church derived from Aquinas' writing on other topics, this apprehension of the image, the object, the scenario, the otherwise distilled outline of something is also a site of ethical exchange. And this is Adequacio, a way of seeing, which involves looking and seeing for a long duration, entirely openly and curiously, with so much intensity that something within the viewer's own selfhood adapts or adequates itself to the purpose of comprehending the thing looked upon. Oh, sorry. I want to try and go back. I had a description of this. There we go. The image as, oh no, I'm going to hop back there. Adequacio, oh well, I'll start again. A way of seeing which involves looking and seeing for a long duration, entirely openly and curiously, with such intensity that something within the viewer's own selfhood adapts or adequates itself to the purpose of comprehending the thing looked upon. This is slightly mystical, naturally, very abstract, and strategically simplified for my purposes here. But what both McGahern the writer and Swift the painter take from it, in my opinion, is the tension generated between self and object, or self and other. The image as agent of Adequacio is not a dead thing, but a mysterious thing which contains bottomless quantities of otherness, and to be equal to it, we ourselves have to be open to being changed by it. None of the Dutch interiors or picture poses or shots of recurrent compulsive photographic memory in McGahern's writing are inertly knowable objects of study. In each instance, they are deeply enigmatic. They are enigmatic signifiers, persisting in the imagination for reasons that are unclear and may never fully give up their privacy. To revisit a scene or image and to dilate it is, in art, to dwell on it and be changed by it repeatedly over time. And incidentally, a visitor to the McGahern home in County Leitrim once remarked on seeing the same book open on the same page in the study from one year to the next. And when it was pointed out, the writer laughed and explained that he was still thinking about it. So I want to jump forward in time to a more recent example of self-aware fiction writing, which sticks with these themes of fixed memory, the distilled image, and literary time in ways that I think are relevant to this. So this is Seylan, and she is an early noughties college freshman in Edouard Matteman's 2018 novel, The Idiot, describing the idea of, the process rather, of writing fiction. I kept thinking about the uneven quality of time, the way it was almost always so empty, and then with no warning came a few days that felt so dense and alive and real that it seemed indisputable that that was what life was, that its real nature had finally been revealed. I wanted to write about it while I still could see it and feel it around me. Suddenly it occurred to me that maybe the real point of writing wasn't just to record something past, but also to prolong the present. And when I read this novel, I cut this out and kept it because it struck me as so very close to the truth. And in this book, the writer, the protagonist is sort of a version of the writer, learning how to write and thinking about it in kind of a usefully meta way. But to tone down the optimism slightly and bring it to a more Irish level, here is a quote from the psychiatrist Ivor Brown, writing years before breakthrough developments in our understanding of trauma on the nature of painful, significant, or otherwise explosive memory. Whenever we are faced with an overwhelming experience that we sense as potentially disintegrating, we have the ability to suspend it and freeze it in an unassimilated, inchoate form and maintain it in that state indefinitely or for as long as necessary. So Brown refers to this as unexperienced experience. Experience left open or running or playing or burning when we have left the room and left the scene and aged, maybe even by decades. Experience that has not even become memory yet because in some potent psychodramatic sense, it is still happening. And if we consider this poetically, and as all researchers in the humanities know, psychoanalytical abstractions remain useful as poetry even when their clinical applications have gone out of style, It is a possible means of explaining the exquisite sense of presence and distension certain, often apparently innocuous memories retain for us. This is something like what Celan means by the uneven quality of time. Its sense of passing banally and then suddenly being siloed into profound, vivid moments of significance. What is significant is not readily available, however, as information. Instead, it is dispersed texturally or phenomenologically, hence the role of the enigmatic signifier in this way of thinking and way of writing. So I have raised these ideas because they constellate the novel, or rather my process of writing the novel, but time constraints mean I do not have time to go into it in great detail, so we'll wrap it up instead with what I hope are more concrete examples. I will come back first of all to the ghost title, How They Met Themselves, and the older associations this brings to me. At some point in my time at university, I read Elizabeth Bronfman's Over Her Dead Body, Death, Femininity and the Aesthetic, which I think is from 1990, which looks at depictions of female death in visual art and spends time on Elizabeth Siddal's resurrection post-mortally as a muse, a phenomenon which means she is eclipsed as an artist in her own right to become an emblem of Rossetti's grief or passion. The famous story of him having her exhumed to retrieve a handwritten book of poems, of her hair growing mythologically to fit the coffin, is an example of this. But the duplication of husband and wife in How They Met Themselves, with a temporal stutter or time warp which discloses misfortune in the style of Freud's Unheimlich, caught my attention precisely because it extracts Siddal from this imaginary and declares her to be what she really is in Rossetti's art, a double, a phantom, a symbol of herself, an archetype, a memory frozen in time for the painter and augmented or fixated upon after she's died. In Sacred Weather, I looked at Susan McGahern as similarly passionately reconstituted over and again by her son, but given up ultimately to the privacy of her own interior life. We see Susan's outline walking the fields barefoot in pain, but we have no psychic access to Susan's difference. Instead, this outline becomes ambulatory, emerging in other images like a watermark, and underlining the fact that when we encounter fixed or compulsive images, memories, or compelling configurations, siloed time, or unexperienced experience still occurring intensely as opposed to being integrated as narrative, we are, corny as this risks sounding, meeting ourselves. As a woman writer, the idea that the object scrutinized might give back nothing but an altered and punctured reflection of the scrutinizer, might equalize them via the obligations of Adequacio, also seemed useful to me poetically. It's also apt that this is in fact no longer the title of my novel at all. If the spirit of this title and the idea behind it survives anywhere, it's in the following sequence from this happy, which I will finish by reading to you now and letting, I hope, it speak for itself. So in this scene, the younger Alana, the protagonist, who is now 23, is addressing her significantly older boyfriend, Harry, on the floor of a studio in Shoreditch. The purpose of the scene is to showcase Alana's self-regarding personality, her performance for Harry as an entertaining coquette, and foreshadow the queasy turn this dynamic is going to take. It's also a chance for me to air a theory I really do have about death and love and glances and frozen images and commitment and the terror of meeting oneself in another, the consolations perhaps of poetry. So Alana is in the habit of sending Harry JPEGs of classic art to communicate her moods and flirt. And in this case, the image in question is Edward Poynter's Orpheus and Eurydice from 1862. So I'll read from the book here. Sometimes when I met Harry, he was quiet, watchful, and horny in a writhingly reptilian way. Sometimes when I met him, he was briskly distant and paternal. This was a day of the latter. Tell me about your Orpheus, he said. The pointer, I said, the painting. Do you like it? I do. Orpheus, I said, is a story I love. The liar. Yes, I stretched out my legs. Are you ready? I am. Orpheus is married to Eurydice, but she is bitten by a snake and she dies. Orpheus travels down to the underworld to rescue her. In a Middle English version, there are walls of ice, a kind of ice tunnel, and people trapped in ice at the moment of their death, glamoured by fairy eyes. Anyway, Orpheus plays the lyre and persuades Persephone to let his wife go, to let Eurydice leave the underworld. There is just one condition, and it is that he cannot look at her. He needs to lead her by the hand from the underworld, from Hades, without turning around. He can't turn around to look at Eurydice until they are safely back in like the world of the living. But he looks. He looks. He turns around and looks at her halfway up. So she dies again. He takes one look at her, one glance, and she tumbles back into the underworld. I imagine like that. I put my hands up in a pose of melodramatic horror. I tilted backwards. It was prayer pose or surrender. It was the cowboys stick 'em up. She's lost. She re-dies. She dies twice. Why do you like it? It fascinates me. I lifted my mug and drank my coffee. I reached over and stroked his hair, which was bushy curls, as dry as a shrub, and seamed unevenly with grey. Because, I said, the question is always, why did he turn around? He had one job, and he failed. But did he fail? I think, and this is my theory, I laughed to show self-deprecation. This is my theory of Orpheus. Actually, a part of him wants Eurydice dead. The point of the story is Orpheus's grief, Orpheus's hero, as the one who brings Persephone round. He's so brave. That is the substance of the story. But really Eurydice can't come back, so he has to get rid of her. The urge to turn, to basically kill her, is, I think, like the urge you have at the top of a tall building on some height to jump. The things you do to self-sabotage. The thing you say that is the one thing you shouldn't say. He wants her back, but really he doesn't want her back, so he kills her again. He can't really decide if he wants her or not. Very interesting, Harry said. The death of a beautiful woman is unquestionably, and this, by the way, is Edgar Allan Poe, the most poetical trope in the world. I winked. I sipped. Orpheus is the proto-troubadour, the proto-breakup album. Blood on the tracks and all that jazz, You, Harry told me then, are intelligent. Of course, I already knew I was intelligent. I'd been called precocious and little madam since I was a child, but at this point, it didn't seem compromising. In his eyes in that instant, I did not feel smart alecky. I suppose I felt seen. It was new and strange, and it made the blood rush to my face. How ridiculous to reflect on this now, but oh, how I held the man in such high esteem. My electric complex and sexual electricity, I must have been easy quarry. Though I cannot so easily dismiss it, I can't condemn him outright, because it was precious to me, this chemistry, this thing I could be for him as I imagined it then, how proud I could make him feel, giving him this share in my development, which is what I did really, great slices of myself. And so I wouldn't run from Drogheda, from the cottage, from Harry, because I had nothing to run to. And anyway, anything I would run to would be boring. Anything that I would run to would be death. I wanted to wait and see, I suppose, how it would turn out. That evening, I finished the charcoal portrait and presented it to Harry. I look like a satyr, he complained. You look like a mystic, I said. But I like you immensely. So I'm going to finish with that. And as usual, I've read so fast, I've finished early. So I'm not sure if people have questions or remarks, but I do hope that what I was going for came across in some way in terms of influence. And I suppose what I'm trying to think and write about, what I've been trying to write about academically, is this compulsive Gestalten. What I really mean is Gestalten. I mean outline and image, and the recurrence of it in one writer, and the recurrence of it in a certain way of remembering, and the recurrence of it in other forms as well, and how to weave this into fiction as opposed to just looking at it as a sort of object under a glass, if that makes sense. So I'll finish there. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Niamh. That was so interesting. And I know myself, I have so many questions and just general praise as well. And yeah, I basically just wanted to open the floor to anybody just for our last bit before we will have our bigger roundtable discussion now at 5. But yeah, I was just wondering, does anybody have any questions that they want to start us off with? So I might possibly just start things off with just this idea of like more alternative titles, just the idea almost of like, are there more of them? Do they proliferate? For instance, like, did you also have kind of competing titles for your second book that you mentioned? Second part of this question is also like, did you encounter that kind of idea with like thesis work as well, or is it more a thing with personal work? I wonder, does more personal writing lend itself to those kind of like different, differing titles?
Yeah, titles are very interesting because I think they're very important. They're the first introduction to the text, and they sort of, it's like the book cover. It gives a shape to how people are going to read it, but I've never been allowed to keep one. They've been changed most of the time. And I don't know if that's like I titled them badly, or if there's a sense that I'm trying to go for something that's being missed out on. So when I wanted to call it How They Met Themselves, I really did want people to look at that picture and see what I meant, because it's not only the fact that they meet their doubles or a sign of death, it's the very melodramatic gestures of the hands up that I wanted to play with as well. I wanted that image, but the consensus was that it was off-putting as a title, and then we ended up fixing on This Happy. And it's interesting that the Swift image that I always wanted to use in the cover is one of these examples of slightly enigmatic signification, although not quite that much, in that the expression on her face is very hard to read. And this is a painting of his girlfriend from 1953. So this idea of This Happy was in itself a title that doesn't commit to being negative or positive. So being on that hinge of not being entirely sure ended up becoming quite a conditioning impulse in the final edit. So it can actually shape the way that you finish the book and how you look at it. Recently, I wrote a short story for The Stinging Fly, which I was going to bring into this paper, but I didn't think I would have time. And there you go, I do, because it duplicates an image that appears in the novel as well, which is based on a real memory that I have, which is one of my strangest childhood memories, being very small and encountering an elderly man passed out under a bush in my hometown. And this would have been about 1992. And I have no context for this. I never told anyone about it. But I can remember encountering this image and feeling immediately an absolutely irrationally overwhelming sense of shame. And the story I was writing was about abortion, and I wrote it against the backdrop of the 8th, when I was sick to the teeth of reading a certain kind of abortion story, and I wanted to write one that actually looked at emotional 3 dimensions. And this image came to me then as this primordial shame that has no logic, this sense of responsibility for someone, and I can't explain it or understand it, and it may not have happened. But that was the sort of idea about duplicate images. But I wanted to call that story Responsibilities. And I was allowed to use that title. And my reason for it was the W.B. Yeats quote, "In dreams begin responsibilities," was exactly the vibe I was going for. And it was a sense that, because I think that something like reproductive rights in Ireland has been tied up with state formation and you know, because art was mobilized a lot of the time in favor of it. I thought it was interesting that we were using this way. It's like when people see of Yeats as a national poet, as forming Irish identity consciously through writing, and the idea of responsibilities as civilians to one another, and you know, all the complexities around that. And I was essentially asked to explain it. So I had to put a note in the story explaining why that was there, which I was kind of thought, you know, I could see why they wanted me to do it, but I wanted to leave it as it was, because I always wanted to be quite enigmatic, and maybe that would ring with some people and it wouldn't ring with others. So mainly the thing about titles is the slant they put on the story. Love Many, which was the short story that won the competition last year and is probably my best known piece of work, was originally called My Brilliant Friend, as a riff on the Ferrante. And I was told immediately to change that because naming something after something is not approved of. You're immediately going to bias the reader into thinking it's a tribute. And I'm so glad that we did change it to Love Many, but that was the editor's idea, wasn't mine. There's so many examples. I wanted to call my PhD Eventing Ireland after Inventing Ireland, and was similarly told not to do that because it was ridiculous. Riff on Declan Kybert for no good reason. Sacred Weather is a quote McGahern had. I mean, at the end I was looking around for a nice quote. You know, when you're naming a conference paper, you're just like, pull a nice quote and make it into the title. But the impact it has is huge on the way people read it. You know, the guide, This Happy, and that image on the cover of the book, I think has a big influence on the way people read it and the way they respond to it, which I find quite fascinating. So it's one of those things that's a bit serendipitous, but has a very big impact.
Yeah, I really like the idea of the title, This Happy, is itself being like hinging, like you said, and itself almost being a double title, suggesting both good and bad. Karen Meenan says, thanks Niamh, brilliant session. I could listen to you all day. I wonder why they didn't allow you to use the original. Oh, that's in response. Okay, excellent. Does anybody else have any other questions? Robert, yes? I'm asking you to unmute. I think you did. Cool.
Thank you for that. That was great. I'm thinking that the second time that one comes to the image in a text, whether even if it's back to back, would not be the same as the first time as a reader. But I'm wondering, as a writer, it's possible that the second time one comes to it, it could feel like a movement toward closure, since it's the second time, or if it could feel like it's becoming verbal in a way, it loses its noun state, and it's sort of opening up. So in your writing, if the image comes up twice and you're conscious of that, how does that feel to you?
Good question. I sometimes wonder if one way of interpreting it, particularly in McGahern, is that it's an attempt to grapple with trauma by revisiting something. But also, if something is written in a certain way and then repeated again verbatim, it makes it's sort of alienating, and it turns it into, I feel almost like an object. It becomes closed off. And there's a running theme in McGahern's work of when his mother is speaking, where she uses religious phrases a lot, like one title for memoir was All Shall Be Well, which is based on St. Therese, no, it's Julian of Norwich. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And it becomes an incantation. And I think that, like, recurring and stuttering as a way of coping with strain is what she does in the book. And I was looking at that in Joyce as well, in Ulysses, when his mother comes back from the dead in the brothel. She's speaking, you know, how I suffered on Mount Calvary, Lord Jesus, you know, she's using this language, and this kind of like, we can hold on to the recurring thing as a sort of life belt that isn't really broken apart or interpreted. So that is one way it possibly can happen. In my own writing, when I'm using it again, I'm hoping sometimes that people will see it. I'm sorry, someone's ringing me. No one ever calls this phone, and then the one time, I'm usually wanting the reader to see it and understand that it's important, that it either stands for something or it's supposed to be uncanny. So the uncanny is an important part of this for me. It's a slight sense of unease, like you've seen this before. Like when McGahern puts things in memoir, which I always think is amazing, because he more or less confesses to all these things being biographical that he insisted weren't. And he's at that point dying. So he never really talked about it, but the fact that he puts them in verbatim seems to me nearly provocative, like he's saying this is this chunk of unintegrated. I think what I'm interested in is that it's not integrated. That's what I like the Brown quote, which is really talking about very serious trauma, but I thought it was this interesting complex that it can't be integrated because it's still happening. So it's being looked at and looked at and looked at. And one point of reference, which I can sort of make when I'm doing creative talking, is if anyone has ever taken DMT, there is a moment in the brain stutter where you get stuck in a moment, and it seems to be maybe there's a thing in the brain that does this recurrent return. But to reproduce it in writing consciously, I think you're playing around possibly with alienation. And in the Leaving Cert, where it got doubled, I thought, here's this writer who's doing something experimental, and by repeating it, it becomes nearly numbing. It turned out to be a complete accident, but it just seems like a weird coincidence that you return to something again and again and again. It's almost, there's a risk that it's inert. And I think what it is that it's not been comprehended or integrated. And that's why I like Adequacio, where it's like you have to spend time with something and you have to change in order to understand it. And it's a very mystical medieval idea, but it actually does have applications in art theory now as well. So that's a bit of a broad answer, but I hope that it answers it in somewhat. Thank you. And thank you, Brian Byrne, as well. I can see your very nice quote here about doing Amongst Women on the Leaving Cert as well. McGahern's role as being the canonical Irish writer is an interesting one to take on then as well, because he's like an emblem for something, and then if you're wanting to look at him askew, you always start from this slightly combative position.
That is so interesting. Thank you so much. Does anybody else have any other questions? Yeah, just to read this out in full. So Brian Byrne said, "Thank you, Niamh. I really enjoyed your talk on McGahern. Like you, I first came across McGahern's work while preparing for my leaving cert, studied amongst women." Sorry, I feel like I covered this as part of my comparative study. He's definitely a writer who wrote outside boundaries. I look forward to reading your monograph on McGahern. So do I.
Thank you, everyone. I will warn you, it got a very ambivalent review there last week, which somebody kindly sent me on Facebook, which.
Oh wow!
It's because it's a bit weird. You know, your PhD. You know, your PhD is it's intense. So just I just ask people to brace themselves. It's not as reader friendly as the novel is.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think. I was wondering, like, do you think of them at all as companion pieces? I know you did talk about your PhD reveals your soul, but yeah, can they be read that way, or is that kind of, you know, is it almost an ironic response to people assuming that, like?
It's actually, I found as well after writing the novel, and even I think PhD is the same, when time passes you look back and realize things you didn't realize at the time. And I do think of them as companion pieces now, but I never thought of them that way when I was writing either of them. It never occurred to me, which is strange because I was editing the two of them at exactly the same time and they came out 6 months apart. So it's obvious looking back that of course they were speaking to each other, but at the time I was never aware of it. But I see now that McGahern gives me a kind of license, I think, as an influence to dwell on images or to dwell on scenes, maybe even for too long sometimes, on purpose in order to have this impact where it's not just ornament, it's kind of part of the story, and it's not entirely clear why it's part of the story. And that's why I'm often using images and memories that I don't really understand myself. I just think it's, if I feel creeped out by it and I don't understand, and I put it in the world, it will have some impact. And I think it's the same with a lot of stuff in McGahern. I do wonder about him putting these things, because I don't feel like he's trying to have authority over his own life. I really do think he's trying to understand it. And so, yeah, they're definitely, I mean, they definitely link together. And my second novel is a lot different in its approach, I think, as well. So I feel also that I've left my 20s behind with these two books, so that, and PhDs do always reveal people's souls. You can tell a lot about somebody by their PhD topic, I promise you. It's like a star sign.
For sure, yeah. I really like that idea as well of those kind of inexplicable dream images. And I feel like I even kind of have a few of them, where a few came to mind specifically from this Happy Two. A lot of them objects as well. And I'm really interested as well, just for my own studies, that you were talking about Beckett and umbrellas in the context of McGahern, I think. And I love the idea of there being a certain thing like a plate that would trigger a given memory. I guess that is very like the sort of Proustian Madeleine or whatever, but I just think it's a really original take on it. So yeah. Tom, you have a question. I will unmute you.
I can do it too, I'm a host.
Yeah.
First of all, I think we're at risk of someone stealing Eventing Ireland as a title. That's brilliant. I think we'll see that come up somewhere. I won't take it myself. I'd be very curious to know what my PhD tells people about my soul. But what I wanted to ask was what I just really loved about your keynote, and kind of everything you've been doing is kind of sitting on that boundary point, not to overuse the theme word of the conference, between academia and creative practice. And I just wondered, kind of to finish maybe on that kind of more meta question, has that made you reflect in any way on kind of academic practice and how it could maybe change, particularly in the humanities?
Yeah, I think that the strange thing is when I was a PhD student, I didn't do any creative writing at all, and all my energy went into academic stuff, and I was quite doctrinally theory-based, and I wouldn't really indulge somebody being creative with their PhD. I would think that was self-indulgent. And then I went the other direction, wrote the novel, and because I was kind of in the academic wilderness for so long, I didn't have anything else to do. And then I was coming back in and I found myself unable to be as stringent as I had been before. I couldn't help but be creative, and I realized a lot of my ideas are ultimately creative ones that are sort of hunches I'm following. But I still feel I'm very you know, I want to hold myself to quite high standards academically, and I don't want to fudge things and just, you know, do something creative which is kind of going to fudge over the line. But at the same time, I realize that the only reason I would ever be drawn towards writing about anything is because in some way it's a creative enterprise. And I think especially with a PhD, you are always doing, you have an emotional relationship with it, which is in excess of just, as I say, information. In terms of the humanities adapting, there is already, certainly in Ireland, quite a healthy overlap between creative and academic, and between artistic and academic. And I think maybe the fear on one side is that it will become too theory based and that nobody will be able to do anything unless they can explain the theory behind it first. And especially when you're looking for funding or looking for, you know, deliverables, when you're looking for funding, that is a risk of sort of chopping things up in that way. So I would hope people will be able to steer clear of that as much as possible. But I think a good example is the art world. So visual art, art writing, and theory seems to have quite a healthy conversation going back and forth between the academy and the world. So maybe that would be a good example to use. So yeah, I'm not sure. I suppose I would be hesitant to say that academia needed to loosen up in a creative direction, because my major fear for the humanities is only that they're going to be diluted by this insistence on deliverables and entertainment. And if anything, they should lock themselves up in the attic and be as dour as possible. But on a personal level, I'm actually finding it hard to get back into hardcore academic writing because I've had so much creative work, and I need to sort of force myself to do that a little bit more. But in terms of that, it doesn't, people always say when you're an academic, if you write, you know, fiction, you'll be psyched out by your own internal theorist or critic, but that never was the case for me, and I'm not sure why. Maybe I'm just lucky, but I haven't found that to be the case. So I would encourage any people who are working in academia and want to do something creative not to be worried about that and just go for it.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting too, that I think there can be an assumption that it leads to you like overthinking the work, but it's really refreshing that you said it actually didn't. So it's really cool.
It also gives people a bit of a rod to hit you with and say that you're an academic writer and that you're writerly and you're, you know, this kind of begrudgery around anything that's a little bit experimental. But again, that's just, I don't really worry about it too much. I find it very healthy. It's not that I think people need to do PhDs in order to write fiction, but I do think the two things for me are very twinned, and they said they feed into each other a lot. And what I'd like to do next, if I can sort of get permanent anywhere, is look at writing in Ireland from the 90s and the noughties, immediately preceding my generation, because I have a couple of ideas about that. And I think I can only really go into that creatively because there's not a lot of theoretical stuff written about it. So it's sort of open to that approach anyway.
That is so interesting. I look forward to hearing more about that project as well, which I'm sure other people do too. So basically we should be probably wrapping up now. That was such an illuminating discussion. I know I probably keep saying that, but yeah, it just, time has flown. Yeah.
Thank you everyone so much. I'm really glad. I wasn't sure how that would go down at all. So yes, thank you everybody.